Okay, so the next realm that we're going to be looking at in this course is the European realm. And so essentially at least western part of Europe, we're going to exclude Russia and a few other nearby countries, but mostly Europe except for Russia. Russia we're going to be covering in the next chapter. And part of Eastern Europe, we're going to kind of hold off on talking too much about those. And we'll cover them more in the next chapter as well. So let's take a closer look. I want to give you a broad overview of the European realm. Again, as a reminder, make sure you know the concepts, ideas, and terms. I think the current edition of the book, it's a little bit longer than this. I've highlighted a few things that we're going to be covering in lecture, but make sure you understand. In fact, I haven't even highlighted everything that we're going to cover, but make sure you understand the complete list of ideas, terms, and concepts. So just to define a little bit, when we talk about Europe as a continent, Europe isn't truly a continent in the physical geography sense, that it's part of a larger landmass called Eurasia. And the division of Europe from Asia is more of a cultural thing than anything really based on the physical landscape. In reality, Europe and Asia are part of the same massive landmass called Eurasia. It's more of a cultural divide, as it turns out, like there's a lot of people over here in the West and a lot of people over here in the East, and then not that many people in between. So there's kind of a historical division between this part, which is the two have kind of developed independently of each other. So Europe is kind of cut off geographically, but it's more of a concept than a real physical thing. I will point out the dividing line that's used are the Ural Mountains in Russia. And so in Russia, you have part of Russia that is west of the Ural Mountains. That's going to be considered the European part of Russia. And the rest of Russia is considered the Asian part of Russia. And the Ural Mountains are, they're not the most impressive mountain range in the world, but because they go north and south, they make a convenient dividing line between the east and west. So that's what's actually happening here. And then down here you have the Caucasus Mountains, some other sea, like the Caspian and the Black Sea, some other physical boundaries that are kind of used to kind of divide this up. We'll look briefly at some of the regions of Europe. And this is a regional map. The line here is meant to kind of show you where the European core is. The core is where most of the population and economic activity takes place. And all of the regions, North, Mediterranean, Eastern, and Western Europe are, have parts of themselves in that core, but Western Europe, in yellow here, is most of that European core. Not everywhere in Western Europe is in the core, but a lot of it is. So Western Europe, when we talk about Europe, usually the Western European countries get a disproportionate amount of attention. Then we have Northern Europe. These are at very high latitudes, very close to the pole, including Iceland, which is way out here, and then the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden, and Finland. Then we have the Mediterranean Europe, or Southern Europe, which is the Portugal, Spain, Italy, Greece, and a few others. And then Eastern Europe, which have been dramatically affected by the Cold War period. And so these Eastern European ones, we're probably going to cover them a little bit more after we've talked about Russia, because then it gives a little bit more context for their history. And particularly for a couple here like Ukraine and Belarus. And they're going to have, their history is strongly entwined with Russia because some of these are parts of the former Soviet Union. So we'll get into that later. Now, but for the European realm in general, it's a pretty small in area, especially compared to Asia. And the countries themselves are relatively small, both in area and population. So it's a collection of small countries, about 40 countries in all. The most populated country and the one with the biggest economy as well is Germany. But even there, it's only 83 million people. So maybe about 2/3 the population of Mexico, for example. So these aren't really huge countries, and they're, in terms of their size, they're comparable to states in the United States. You have France and United Kingdom have about 67 million people, about even with each other. But you know, the point being is that there isn't one huge dominant country. The closest one is Germany, but Germany itself is pretty close, both in economic terms and population, to its neighbors. Now, one thing unique in Europe is that you have microstates as well. These are tiny little countries that are independent. For example, Monaco is a tiny little microstate that's right next to France. And so one thing about being a collection of small countries is that encourages efforts for the countries to work together. And that's a concept called supranationalism that we'll cover. For example, they're part of an economic union called the European Union. Many of them share the same currency, the euro, which is kind of like a European dollar. We'll also look at Europe as a place where also pressure for regions and countries themselves to break apart from each other. That's called devolution. So devolutionary forces are those that strain or pull countries apart. Sometimes these have to do with culture, sometimes they're economic, and for whatever reason, certain countries have pressures to break into smaller countries. Another trend that we'll look at with the European realm is the demographic transition. We talked about that briefly in the introduction to the course, where in the more industrialized countries, there has been a slowing of population growth. And so Europe is probably one of the best examples of this, especially countries like Germany, where you have slower population growth and you have an aging population. And because of that, there is a real need to bring in people from the outside to fill in jobs. So there's a great need for migration to fill in for that aging workforce. And lastly, just the physical environment of Europe. It's a diverse physical. There's a lot of different environments from near the North Pole to the Mediterranean. The southern part is probably about the latitude of California. And then it's about from like maybe where California would be in the United States up to nearly the polar regions. There's a diversity of natural resources, oil, coal, gas, a whole bunch of things. But probably the most important thing is the shape of the environment itself. It's that it's a physical environment that encourages trade. And so the physical setting, the site qualities of Europe is really good for making ports and airports and shipping places for boats to dock. And then on top of that, it's at a really central location for world trade. So let's just kind of delve into that a little bit. A peninsula is a piece of land that extends into the water. So kind of like Italy. Italy is a classic peninsula. So most of the country is an extension of land into the Mediterranean here. And Europe is almost like a peninsula full of other peninsulas. So there's a number of, we have the Scandinavian peninsula, the Italian peninsula, Spain. In addition, there's a number of island countries. We have Ireland, United Kingdom, various and others in the Mediterranean. And we also have estuaries, which are places where the ocean and large rivers come into contact with each other. So one way this has affected their history is that Europe has, for a long period of time, been a very outward-looking part of the world, that it's this configuration of high contact with the ocean has encouraged trade with the outside world. And that's a big part of European history, and which extends into colonization and the transatlantic slave trade and all kinds of other aspects of global history. So the short of it is you can describe it physically as a peninsula of peninsulas. And then the other aspect is if you kind of look at the world sort of from the top, you know, you have this physical setting that is helpful for trade, but you also have a good relative location in the world, that it's close to North America, close to Africa, close to Asia, that it's centrally located. And so one way to describe it is the crossroads of the land hemisphere. And if we look at a globe, if you look at the top part of the globe, so if we look at the top part of the globe, you can see there's a whole lot of land. And if we look at from the bottom, with the exclusion of Antarctica, there's the southern part of the globe is dominated by ocean. So the top part here is called the land hemisphere. And if you look at this land hemisphere here from the top, Europe is very centrally located here. And so one aspect of trade with Europe is the concept of a break of bulk points. We talked a little bit about containerized shipping in a previous module, but there's a whole lot of trade that happens within Europe. Now it pales in comparison to East Asia, which we'll cover later in the semester, but it is a very important hub for world trade. This term intra-pay is similar to a term called break of bulk point. These are places where goods are moved from one type of transportation to another. And so you have places in Europe where you have large rivers that meet up with the ocean. And the rivers are very wide and navigable, so you can move goods from the interior of the country to ports and then load them onto ocean-going container ships. In addition, you have a whole lot of well-developed roadways, trains, and so on. So Europe is a very well-connected country for world trade. And so there's a term for that. That term for being well-connected is transferability. Transferability means how easy it is to move goods to consumers. And Europe has high transferability because of the amount of contact with the ocean. So it's easy to develop shipping ports and that sort of thing. Also a well-developed train network, navigable rivers that crisscross Europe, and just other modern infrastructure. And then the other component of that is complementarity, that if you're positioned to trade, it doesn't really help you unless you have people to trade with. The complementarity gets at that. If one region produces an excess amount of goods, then they can sell those goods to another place. So that's one thing, and part of the development of trade in Europe is maybe one region produces a greater amount of coal, one maybe produces a greater amount of steel or iron, one produces more food, but that complementarity, that building up of excess goods for trade is another kind of economic aspect of the development of trade in the European realm. So in fact, you can have double complementarity where two regions produce two different things that each other need, and so that encourages that trade. Now, that doesn't really help you unless you can get the goods to each other. That's where transferability comes in. So Europe has both the need for trade and the infrastructure and environment that supports the trade.